Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialize in websites for counselors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counselors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hi, I'm Rory and welcome to episode 326 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. As technology becomes an increasingly integral part of our lives, it's also making its mark in therapy, offering new ways to support clients in meaningful and accessible ways. I'm thrilled to be joined by Nina Solomons, the co-creator of Anomi, creating safe spaces in virtual reality. Nina will share her insights on the innovative piece of technology designed for clients who prefer therapy in a virtual environment. Together, we will explore how virtual reality opens up new possibilities for therapeutic experiences. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Ken.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 326 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Both Rory Oakes and myself, Ken Kelly, are delighted to welcome you to our three topics today, starting off with that ethical, sustainable practice, where today we're going to be discussing ambiguous loss. We then go into practice matters, and as Rory has beautifully introduced, Nina is going to be speaking about clients expressing their thoughts in virtual reality. Wow, interesting topic. We then move on to recognizing you, our students, on your formal journey to become a counsellor or a psychotherapist. And the topic today that we're covering in student services is a critique of the person-centered model. So there you have it. You'll definitely be looking at that in your assignments. So starting us off, Rory, that ambiguous loss under ethical sustainable practice. What is ambiguous loss?
Well, I mean, ambiguous loss is when something is physically absent, someone or something is physically absent, but psychologically present. So let me give you an example of that. Many of us will have experienced our children going off for further education. My daughter went off to university and she left the house. And after many years of her pottering around the house, she just wasn't there anymore. And both myself and my wife felt a loss. We knew that she was okay, but she wasn't around. And it was a really strange sensation. So on one level, ambiguous loss can be experienced by a lot of people. What about those who still remember their first loves? I know I do. And just sometimes in an unguarded moment, just thinking about your first romance or your first lover, and I wonder what they're doing now. I wonder where they are now. It creates a kind of disconnected feeling, a bit of a yearning in some cases. But when we talk about grief and what we see in the therapy room, I mean, we can see both of the two examples I gave. But what about someone who comes and says their partner was lost at sea, or was in a natural disaster and they haven't recovered the body? It's kind of a very, very stressful form of loss, because you don't get the chance to say goodbye to the person. With normal losses, at some point, hopefully, you get the chance to speak to the person and say goodbye. But ambiguous loss is where you never get that chance. It's unfinished business. And I think it can apply to lots of areas in our life where people have had accidents and it's changed their personality. People who have maybe memory-related problems such as Alzheimer's, or people in addiction, loved ones in addiction, where the person they were has gone. They're replaced by the addiction, sadly. That is ambiguous loss, and it can be one of the more tricky ones, I think, to navigate.
Thank you, Rory. Yes, it is tricky. And I broke it down into the two words. So we've got ambiguous and we've got loss. And we understand loss as something that is no longer here, no longer accessible to us. Ambiguous kind of means not clear for me. Ambiguous. It's not clear. And the example that I was thinking of was losing your keys. So here's two scenarios. One is going to be loss, and the other one is going to be ambiguous loss of one's car keys. Yeah, to make it nice and easy to understand. So if I am wading in the sea, and I'm wading in the sea, and then I realize that my car keys fall out of my jacket pocket and they get carried away by the sea. They're gone. They're lost forever. I know they're gone, and now I need to come to terms with that. I need to go through a process of coming to terms that I have lost my keys. They're gone. I'm never going to see them again. It's very different to going out on a walk or a hike, and you get back to your car and then you look for your car keys and you can't find them. Now, they're still gone, but it leads to thinking of, did I drop them while I was walking on the path? Do I go and walk the path again? What happens if somebody finds my keys? Could they take my car? And it leads to a whole lot of different processes, thought processes, because of the ambiguity. I don't know what has happened. And you spoke beautifully, Rory, of kind of giving some examples of what that may look like. I think of people being taken as hostage. That person is no longer there, but not knowing what is happening to them. Where might they be? Are they alive? Are they no longer alive? There's that ambiguity, and it creates a whole lot of different processes and thinking. And of course, I guess we could look at Alzheimer's as being a form of ambiguous loss, where you have the person right in front of you. They're physically here, but yet they're not. They're not the person they once were. And you used a beautiful example speaking about addiction. I can still see that person. They look the same, they sound the same, but it's not them anymore. I've lost that part of that person. And it leads to a whole lot of different processes that are different to if the person was just lost and they passed away and they were gone. There's a process of coming to terms with that, and we know what happened. But when that person is maybe missing, as you mentioned, Rory, that's when the ambiguity comes in of what is it, isn't it, what might that look like, where might they be, and a whole lot of different processes. And I guess when we see ambiguous loss within the therapy room, the client might be bringing those processes around the ambiguity, the not having closure, not having a clear understanding of what has gone on. Have I understood that correctly, Rory?
Yeah, you have. I mean, one of the most presentations, or one of the predominant presentations, is ends of relationships where someone has just walked out and not given the person a reason for leaving. And, they come and they go, well, we were doing, I mean, this isn't just in the practice room, this is friends that I've had where they've just left. And, one partner's just gone. One morning, they come home in the evening, the wardrobe's empty, and they've left, and they've not said why they've gone. And it leaves, it's a rather Kafkaesque idea where the person has no idea what they've done wrong or what's happened. And of course, it can lead to self-blame, and kind of double guessing yourself. I think another example, and I think the one that's been in the press recently, is that if someone has a brain injury, it could alter their personality. And that person that you married is no longer the person they were because they've had a brain injury. And again, you talked about Alzheimer's. I've come across that, certainly in my wider network, but also people who've had brain injuries and they've just changed. The people they're not the same people. And there's a yearning for that person. If someone's married someone, they've had an accident, they've had a brain injury, their personality's changed, and the person is yearning to rekindle a person that they married. And of course, they're gone because of the brain injury. So I think ambiguous loss is more common than we probably realise. I think a lot of people listening to this will go, Rory, I think Rory's right. I think Rory and Ken are right on this one.
Yeah, very, very much so. And there is a television cartoon program called The Simpsons, which has been going for decades, so you may have heard of it. And there's a character called Nelson, who is the bully of bullies Bart Simpson. And ambiguous loss kind of defines who this character is, because when you hear his backstory, if you watch enough of The Simpsons, as I did back in the day, Rory, you find out that his dad went out to go and get a packet of cigarettes and never came back.
Yeah.
Never came back when he was a very, very young boy. And he keeps on replaying that over and over again. Will Dad come back? Did he leave because of something I did? And it kind of defines the personality of the character within the Simpsons. So it's kind of built around this ambiguous loss of this character. And so I guess, okay, we've got an understanding now of what ambiguous loss is. And I like, Rory, how you've kind of pointed to we can look in our own lives. To understand ambiguous loss in our clients, we can look in our own lives. And undoubtedly, if you look carefully enough with an understanding of what ambiguous loss is, you're going to look at your own ambiguous loss and look at what are the feelings that come up around ambiguous loss for you. What does it feel like? Is it resolved? Because ambiguous loss will show itself in lack of closure. It's that ambiguity just doesn't allow for closure on the topic. The next question is, does ambiguous loss link in with our understanding of other types of grief, Rory?
Well, it does. It links in with something called anticipatory loss, where a person is aware that maybe death or loss of a loved one is likely, and the grieving begins long before. So that can be where someone has a life-ending illness, a terminal illness, and it leaves their partner or their loved ones or their friends anticipating the loss of that person. And it can also lead to something called frozen grief, which is where the brain freezes, not literally, it doesn't go cold and freeze, but what it does, it stops processing in a way to help the coping mechanism of grief. So sometimes people just get frozen is a good word. They just stop connecting with themselves or others, and are unable to proceed in their lives because they're trying to resist they're trying to resist the fact that someone's gone. They may be living in false hope that at some point they'll just walk through the door again. I've spoken to people who say that, they've been to someone's funeral and they say any minute this person's going to walk through the door. And they believe it. They think that, the whole thing was a bit of a facade. And at some point, the person's just going to walk through and go, hi, I'm back. And they just won't believe anything else. So it can be, those two links are very strong, Ken, very strong. Anticipatory loss and frozen grief.
Yeah, and I guess we can add to that the disenfranchised grief, where the grief that the person feels, the loss that they feel, can't be shown. They have to hide it. There's an incongruence there. I have to keep it buried. I've got to show a brave face to the world, but inside, I'm feeling very different to that, and I'm not able to show what that looks like. And I guess this brings us on, now that we understand kind of what ambiguous loss is, how it kind of links in with other types of grief that we might study as counselors and psychotherapists. We then come on to our clients that come in, and how we might work with ambiguous loss when it presents itself within the therapy room. And I think a good starting point is what does not work. And you mentioned, Rory, you were talking about your first love, and it cast my mind back to mine as well. And I remember my first love left me. I was absolutely devastated. Honestly, the emotions were so incredibly powerful and raw. And I went to my dad, who I looked at as kind of the strong person who had all of the answers. And I said, "What do I do?" And he said, "Time will heal." And I tell you what, Rory, it didn't help a jot. It really didn't. So what doesn't help in these kind of situation is sympathy, hearing time is going to heal that, waiting for closure. Because of the ambiguity, closure does not just naturally come as it does through a natural grieving process. Absolute black and white thinking does not help around ambiguous loss. Isolation, the person isolating themselves, just sitting on their own, does not shift it. It doesn't go. It can sit with them. Blame, revenge, belief that bad things happen to bad people, and need always to be in control and resisting change are enemies of working with ambiguous loss. So I wonder, what does help? What can we do as a counselor, psychotherapist? We have a client, they're presenting, we can clearly see this feels to us like ambiguous loss. We can, at some level, definitely relate to what that person empathically might be feeling, because we've looked at ourselves and explored what ambiguous loss is to us. How might we work with that, Rory?
Well, it's quite interesting because there is a website or an organisation called the Ambiguous Loss, Ambiguous Loss UK, in fact, and Chloe Swinton, who is a spokesperson for them, talked about something called the March model, and it's named after the first letter of its components. Mastery, acceptance, resilience, connection, and hope. And the model's summed up really, but with the quote, "You can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf." And it's really true. And I think that helping someone to accept that person has gone is really important. It's one of those peculiar things that therapists are rather different to the vast majority of the population when they talk about death, because lots of people say, well, they've gone to sleep or they've moved on, or there's lots of very nice kind of euphemisms for death, but actually therapists do actually speak about death. I would say, your partner has died, because that's the reality of it. And I think that can be sometimes very helpful. It might sound incredibly insensitive and incredibly cruel, but to get to the facts of the matter, the reality, where we're at or where the client is, I think it can be very useful. And we have to be very thoughtful when we do that. But, mastery is about helping someone take control of their life, and, realizing that things are outside somebody's control. You can't control everything. And acceptance, as I said, some level of acceptance, not as a finality, but just to realize that, the person has gone, or in your case, the relationship has ended, and allowing grief. I think that the thing with ambiguous loss is grief actually doesn't kick in. Because it's held, if you like, it's held in suspension. So, allowing the grieving process, sitting with the client when they finally realize that, there is a loss here. And, if if it's someone who is, we talked about people with dementia or Alzheimer's, sometimes just understanding the process of that. I tell you what was mighty handy in our family. My grandson is autistic, and he's going to need a lot of support through his life. We love him to death, but he's going to need a lot of support through his life and even into his adult life. And, one of the things that we had to grieve as a family, I guess, is that he wasn't the person we thought he may be. Everybody thinks of the children growing up and doing this and moving on and moving out and leaving. And by researching and getting really involved in my grandson's autism and understanding it has been mighty helpful to come to terms with, I guess, the loss of what we believed he would be. We love him to death, and we wouldn't have him any other way. But I think I speak for myself. I'm not going to speak for the rest of my family. But I think that there is a loss process that had to be engaged with, and resilience. Helping people be resilient. Thinking about what learning has taken place during the loss. What have we learned? What conclusions have we come to? And I also think about promoting well-being, emotional well-being, and it could be physical, it could be spiritual, it could be religious, but making sure that, helping the client maybe to look after themselves. And that's a simple thing, such as, well, I'm getting out a bit more, I'm going for a walk around the block, I'm going to meet friends, I'm eating a little bit healthy, I've stopped drinking, and just acknowledging that and saying, it sounds to me like you're putting your well-being first, and you're looking after yourself, and discussing how that's helping. So that's quite a useful model to look at, Ken.
Very, very much so. So you've been through the mastery, you've looked at acceptance, you've spoken a little bit about the resilient side of things, and then of course there's connection, speaking about it, being in a support group where others share the same kind of journey. So just going back, there's two sides to this, and you're speaking, Rory, you're saying maybe sometimes it's about coming to terms with the loss and losing the person, but there are times when that ambiguity, there is not a knowing whether that person is alive or dead. And that is the ambiguous part of this, and I think again about going to war. A partner goes off to war. You don't know what that might look like. It must have been terrible for the people losing people in war, but not knowing whether they were lost in war or not knowing whether they were going to come back, but being involved and connecting with others in the same kind of a situation, being able to speak about it, being able to speak about the reality, the feelings that are going on for you is helpful in the connection side of things. And then the other side of this is hope, but it's not the false hope that the person is suddenly going to walk through the door. It is hope that you yourself, going through this ambiguous loss, can overcome this and find meaning within your life, even if there isn't closure, even if you are not 100% sure of what happened or what is happening to that person, or whether they are alive or whether they are no longer with us. That hope that there is a way that you can find joy again, I guess, in your present moment, because within hope you can discover the purpose that is the fit for you. So there's some really, really interesting things on this ambiguous loss. We've got a super duper handout, as always, that Rory has created. It covers the definition. It goes into the different types of ambiguous loss. You're going to get the challenges of ambiguous loss from this handout, beautifully laid out. And then how it links in with the other types of grief. Your own ambiguous loss, looking at that and exploring that as personal development, but also maybe as a healing process as well. And then the supporting of clients with ambiguous loss, and it covers the March model, giving you an overview of what that looks like so that you can kind of take that information in, and then right at the end of that, as always, it is beautifully referenced. So if you did want to delve a little bit deeper into this topic, you can use those links. And if you wanted to get that handout, what do? You just go to counsellingtutor.com. That's our website. Click on the podcast tab, find your way to episode 326, and you can download it. It's free of charge, and it's right there on that page. Now, Rory, before we leave Ambiguous Loss, any final thoughts?
Well, I think being realistic, it may be that there isn't a resolution to ambiguous loss, that people just have to live with it. I think grief in general is something that doesn't get any less. It's just our lives expand round it. So it was thought for a long time that with loss that it would fade away as we moved away from the event or events that produced the loss. But the thinking now is that the loss is still as big years on as it was at the time. But what's happened is our life has grown around it. And I think that's a message of hope, because for those who's experienced loss, and I think every person probably listening to this has experienced it, have a sit and have a think, just reflect how much your life has grown since the loss. And what happens is your life just expands around it and fills up for those who move on. And I think that gives hope. It's certainly given hope for the losses in my life, because as your life expands, it becomes hopefully richer, hopefully more connected. And, you never forget the people who you've lost, but they're not principally in your mind all the time, or hopefully not.
Yeah. Beautifully said, Rory, and a great topic. And I think there's a very heart-touching case study of this with Madeleine McCann. I'm old enough to have been there and watching this play out. And Madeleine McCann's parents have gone on to do great work around the loss of children. That was their hope. They went out and made a difference in the world. And, I will share, I don't often share this, I'm pretty open on the podcast, but we lost our son when he was very, very young. And we poured what we were left with from that into an association in South Africa called ASD, which is Association for the Sensory Disabled, and that continues to do great work today. So from that loss, and there was a great ambiguous loss around that for us, we were able to find that hope. So I guess there is a spark, there is a light to it, but it is a very heavy topic, and I guess as human beings, we're not built to just be able to kind of cope with these kind of ambiguous losses. They are incredibly challenging. It's really worth doing a little bit of CPD on this, so that when a client does maybe bring this to a session and you see that you're able to hold that person and work with that person in a way that is meaningful to them. And that is today's ethical, sustainable practice. And we move on from ethical, sustainable practice into Practice Matters, the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Rory, you met up with Nina and you spoke about virtual reality. Very high tech, I have to say.
It is very high tech, and it's even high tech because the client wears these goggles, these virtual reality goggles. And I think it just speaks to the fact that technology, I mean, we're using technology now. We're 150 miles apart, or 100 and something miles apart. We're using technology to make this podcast. Technology is becoming a part of counselling and psychotherapy, meeting specific client needs. And, we're all about, helping the clients and trying to meet their needs. So I was delighted to speak with Nina Solomons, the co-founder of a virtual intervention tool called I Know Me. It's not spelt I Know Me, but I Know Me. And this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. to access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
I recently watched a TED Talk by Chris Milk, an American filmmaker and immersive artist, who stated virtual reality is the ultimate empathy machine, which is a neat segue into introducing today's guest, Nina Solomons, CEO and co-founder of Anomi, a visual intervention tool helping clients express their thoughts in virtual reality. So, Nina Solomons, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me here. I look forward to our conversation.
Now, today we're going to be talking about virtual reality effectively on the radio, which is a bit of a challenge because virtual reality is a visual medium. But before we talk about what virtual reality is and how it can assist in therapy, just tell us a little bit about how Anomi came to be, how your company came to be formed.
So back in 2018, I was bringing virtual reality into prisons in the UK, specifically in a UK Nottingham prison. And when I met the prisoners there, our focus was creating content and training them and enable them to give them soft skills so that they'd be able to find work or housing afterwards. But another thing that I realized that when I was working with them, VR, according to them, reduced their thoughts of suicide and self-harm. Another thing I realized was that the incarceration rate was really high. And when you spoke to any of the lads, you asked them, how often have you been in here? A couple of them would say like, oh, this is my like 5th or 7th time. So it made me realize that their writing and reading abilities were not the best. And it would be really difficult to give them a lot of work which required reading or writing or doing intensive theoretical work. If I could give them a virtual environment where they could learn to express themselves in a playful way that was gamified and didn't look or feel like therapy, and they were not in a prison cell, but in a virtual safe environment that they had created, maybe they would open up to a therapist. And the therapist could come in remotely and listen to them, see what they built, see what they created, and a prisoner would be able to draw or create their story of why they were in there. 2020 happened, lockdown happened, all of those projects stopped, but I got COVID myself. And with that, I lost my ability to speak. I lost my ability to walk. And I thought I was going absolutely mad. But I did have virtual reality, and it was my form of escapism. And because I was unable to find words or create sentences at the time, I heavily relied on just a couple of words that would try to describe my current state of mind. I think right now they're discovering that, COVID is very similar to having stroke or dementia or Alzheimer's. It has a lot of cognitive impacts on the brain. And I asked my therapist, who was remote, to start using virtual reality to do therapy because I couldn't do it on a Zoom call. I couldn't use words to communicate. And what I discovered was what I had intended for the prisoners, or what I thought would be useful for them, it was useful for me. I wasn't in a prison cell, but I was in a home cell. I was in my room, and that became my prison because I couldn't leave. And virtual reality was my way of communicating really complex emotions, scenarios, and thoughts in something that looks quite simplistic, but is actually able to communicate a lot through what I call spatial language.
It's interesting. I'll pick up on a couple of things there. One of them is, within therapy and indeed education in general, a safe space, a held area is incredibly useful. And in terms of work with prisoners, of course, I think what we talked about this on the podcast. I interviewed someone on the podcast a little while ago who works in the prison, and one of the challenges is that there's no decompression. In other words, when someone comes into a therapy room, they have therapy, and then they would go home by whatever means of transport they came. Could walk, they could be in a vehicle, or they could go on public transport, bicycle. With prisoners, they literally go out of the therapy room back into the prison again, and care and thought needs to be about containment and safety in therapy. And certainly prisoners can't afford to be seen as vulnerable in some situations because it makes them more vulnerable. So the idea of virtual reality as a way of providing a therapeutic container, I think is really fascinating. Now, for those who are listening, just explain the tools that one would need to get involved in virtual reality. Can you explain what equipment you might need and how that might look?
Well, virtual reality is actually something that's a little bit complicated for some people who've never heard of it before, might have heard it before, tried Google Cardboard or Samsung Gear VR. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about like a Quest headset or a PlayStation VR headset or a Pico headset. Now, there have been several iterations of those, but Anomi, the software that I created, is specifically compatible with the Quest headset, Quest 2s and Quest 3s and Quest Pros. The reason why we decided to go with Meta's ecosystem is because it's the most accessible. And I realized that during the lockdown, a lot of children stopped speaking. And also they feel quite uncomfortable on Zoom calls with therapists. They would turn their cameras off and actually not really engage during the lockdown. So the way that the software works, it works from a browser. So a therapist or a coach or anybody that has a computer and a mouse is able to go to anomi.io, create an account, and then they need a headset. So you need a Quest 2 or 3 or Pro. And with that, you can go to the Meta App Lab. You can download it for free. And your client, or you yourself, if you want to, put on the headset, and you have a special 6-digit code on the wall. You give that to your therapist, and they type that onto the computer. That's a security code, and then they'll be able to see what you're doing. So the way that it works is you require Wi-Fi, you acquire a Quest headset, and you acquire a computer. The beauty of it is that we've created it for remote, meaning that therapist is not in the same room, or you are not in the same room, or maybe it's too far to travel in, but you do have a Quest headset. You can have that embodied experience. You can go into a virtual environment without requiring that travel time.
Sure.
So that's what you require to
make
make
it work. In terms of a headset, I was in my local branch of Currys, which is an electrical outlet, and I was looking at headsets, and basically they're like a set of goggles that you put over your eyes, and they have to simplify, a TV screen inside. And when you connect it to the internet and you connect it to virtual reality, what you're seeing is a space created virtually in the headset, and it's like you're in another room. So when I used it, I was in, I think it had a game on. I was in some kind of, I was playing Tomb Raider, so I was in some kind of Egyptian tomb. And if I looked to the left and right, up and down, I was in that tomb. It was, sometimes the term's immersive. In other words, it feels like you're really there, hence the term virtual reality. And that's the kind of headset. And the one you're speaking about is specifically for the Meta platform. That connects to the Meta platform. So I think that's helpful. We will put a link to some video content in the show notes. I'll speak about that later. So what is virtual reality useful for when working with clients? Why would someone say, I think I might try virtual reality in the service of my clients?
Well, right now you've got some glasses on. and Meta have released some AR glasses, and there's something called augmented reality, which basically puts digital overlays into your real environment. So you still see the real environment through your glasses, but there will be digital information overlay, very like science fiction. I would use virtual reality if you're trying to bring a person into a safe space, or you're trying to have them disconnect from the environment that they're currently in. So if they're home, or they're in their bedroom, or they're in an office space, but you want them to reconnect to something that might be a memory or an idea or a concept or an emotion or a feeling, you can bring them into Anomi. And what we do is we've created a white space, a white room, which is completely blank. So the moment that you put on the VR headset and you connect to your therapist, you're in a white gallery space. And the beauty of this is that we haven't put anything in the space there to prompt or create any emotion. Everything comes from you. So the therapist's job is to prompt or ask questions like, how are you feeling today? Well, or if we're talking about trauma, what are some of the things that we talked about? Is there a way that you could potentially draw or create it for me? One of the things that I did a lot in my therapy sessions was family dynamics. So having to create or draw my father, my mom, my sister, my brother, and myself. And what you start seeing, kind of like with maybe dolls or play, is you can start seeing colors, you can start seeing shapes, and all of these things actually have meaning. So we co-designed this with creative art therapists. This is based on creative art therapy. But what we also have is, for example, it's between characters. So say, for example, you've created your father, you have a very bad relationship with him. You might draw him further away from you without realizing that you've done that. Or you might have created and drawn him and he's really large, overbearing, like a giant demon figure. And you might not have realized you've done that. But as you start drawing, as you start creating it, you start realizing these things really, really quickly, things that you might not have acknowledged when you try to communicate it with words. I might talk to you and say, I don't have a good relationship with my father, but you might not understand how intimidating it might actually be until you go into virtual reality and you create that scenario and you share it with somebody.
Yes. And yeah, so you go into a completely blank space and the client can develop and draw their own world. And I think I heard you say earlier that this could be done remotely, so people who do online and telephone or work remotely may be interested in this. But I was fascinated to hear that this could be done in the room. So you could be in a room with a client and in another room in virtual reality, and you can see by symbols and by the distance of the characters that the client can produce their own world, and that you can look at it. Therapists don't interpret, but they can just ask questions or reflect on what's being drawn. I would imagine that some client groups would enjoy that more than others. I'm thinking probably children would be quite taken with that. I don't know if you've done any research on which client groups tend to be interested in virtual reality.
Well, the charity we're working with concentrate on young adults and children. So there it's taken a big uptake, especially with boys who don't like engaging with therapy, who don't like doing play therapy or don't like expressing themselves. Using virtual reality is a great way to engage with them, and especially those who are neurodiverse as well. What we've purposely done is we have not put you, the therapist, as an avatar in the space with the client. And the reason we've done this is because we've realized during the lockdown when we were experimenting that the moment you, as a therapist, put on a headset, it's quite exhausting for you. If you've got 6 clients and you're in VR for 6 hours, it's not good. You get eye strain, you get exhausted, the headset gets hot, it's uncomfortable. But if you are just watching from a browser, it's something that you're already familiar with. Like for a lot of therapists, it's already a big deal going online or doing therapy online. So going into VR is the next step. But we wanted a client to feel safe and not feel judged necessarily, especially by having another person or character or eyes in the room, where you kind of become is a little bit of a camera. We give you 3 different camera options you can control. So you can fly around the space, you can see your client from afar, or you can see what they're drawing from their perspective, or you could put the camera on a tripod further away from them in case the client's physically running around the room. But the way that we kind of say it is, usually when you have a therapy session, you've got like maybe 5-10 minutes of, hello, how are you doing? How are you feeling today? What do you want to talk about? And then if they want to, you can say, do you want to go into Anomi? And then they can choose to say yes. And they'll go into that white space and you can start talking about the topics that are quite difficult. Or you can ask them to create their safe space. But you have the control from the browser to teleport them from the safe space to the room where they're going to have to do the potentially traumatic hard work and really face their fears. And you also have the ability to control what tools they have available. So if they feel overwhelmed, you as a practitioner always have the control of the tools as well as the space, as well as the camera. So there are a couple of things that we designed, particularly with the idea of you still have control. So there's no other VR application at the moment that has that type of ability. And we think that's really, really important to give the therapist the feeling that they still have control of the space, of the tools, and as well as the camera, of their own comfort as well.
Sure. So what I basically heard you said was that the therapist doesn't have to wear a headset. The client wears a headset, and you engage them through the browser. A web page, I guess, would be a layperson's terms, a browser, and you would then direct that as part of therapy. So there might be some, if you're working online, there might be some in the room therapy in terms of online therapy. You see the client, and then they could choose to use the headset and explore things. But all times, you would be able to remove them from that room should they become maybe distressed or disorientated. But also, you wouldn't be actually in the room, so they would be, they wouldn't be distracted by, you use the word avatar, and an avatar, I had to look this up a few years ago. An avatar is a kind of graphical representation of you. When I went into a program, I think I had a stick person, it was that kind of thing. So I guess it brings me on to another question. I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, this sounds really interesting, but how do I get into it? I mean, the client will have to buy some equipment. They will need the visor to be able to get into it. Is there any training that you offer, or any training that could be helpful? And is it something, so there's 2 questions here, is it something that the average therapist would get involved with? Because there's a lot of technical aspects to this that might be a bit of a barrier to clients accessing. I wonder where you are with that.
Yeah, so the partner that we have, Imara, they've created a 2-day training course. The first day involves safeguarding, onboarding, understanding what type of client this tool could be useful with, why or why not. And the second day is more hands-on training. You physically show up, they've got headsets, and you do role play. So you either are the client or you are the therapist. My therapist is not an art therapist. She is just a traditional CBT therapist. And we've also done EMDR in VR as well with it. So she's actually had 0 training, of course, because we were experimenting. But the beauty of it is really just understanding what you can use the tool for. So if you're working on trauma, if you're working on PTSD, if you're working on movement, if you're working on eating disorders or feeling emotions in your body, this is a tool that could potentially help make that a little bit faster than usual. What I also like to say is that because we use 6-stop headsets, which is 6 degrees of freedom, meaning that the headset is able to track your movement in space. If you have a big room, you're able to say things like, I want you to crawl under the table that you've just created. Or I want you to, what we had, for example, with the Ukrainian refugees, they were also using the tool, is recreating attacks that the Russians did whilst they were at home, and recreating that environment and challenging those memories and those conceptions of that trauma.
Yes.
So I think if you are a therapist who is comfortable with Zoom or using any sort of online tools to do phone calls, this is a great tool. If you have kids who play video games, or you have young clients that are tech savvy, most kids are tech savvy. A lot of kids will potentially have headsets at home. So we actually had a therapist at the charities. She was saying, their client couldn't make it to the session, but they did have a headset at home, so they could do the session anyways.
Sure.
Again, the beauty of it is in the immersion, in that feeling that you're really there and being able to challenge those emotions that you feel in your body once you're in the virtual space. But if you feel like this is too much or it's too scary, I do recommend going to Amara's website, checking out their hands-on training and seeing how they're using it with their clients. We're just a software company, but we're going to develop further training as well, because we're also working with coaches too. They find this a useful tool to visualize potential futures, for example.
Well, if you want to see a demonstration of Anomi, if you go to counsellingtutor.com, if you locate the podcast tab, and the links to the video demonstration and the training will be in the show notes of episode 326. And it just remains for me to say, Nina Solomons, thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you to Nina Solomons. Thank you, as always, to you, Rory, for reaching out and holding those all-important discussions, showing us that the technology is being used more and more for us to be able to connect with clients, and who knows where that may end up going. So we move out of practice matters and we recognize you, the students, as we move into student services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting. And it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counsellingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counsellingskillsacademy.com. And today in Student Services, we're looking at a critique of the person-centered model. Rory, this is an interesting one because I see it in the Facebook group all the time. And if you're interested in joining our Facebook group, go to Facebook and type in Counselling Tutor. You'll find us. And it is sometimes a bit challenging for some students to critique a model, specifically if it's the main model that you might be studying. So it's your main model, and then you're asked in an assignment to kind of critique it. What's wrong with it?
Yeah. And I think it's very important that we don't become blind to the downsides or the inadequacies in some cases of the models that we practice. Every therapeutic model has a critique, and rightly so. I think we shouldn't be blindly following a model and thinking it's everything to all people. And there are some specific critiques around person-centered therapy. And I think one focuses on Rogers' thoughts in his 1957 paper in the Journal of Consulting Psychology, the 6 necessary and sufficient conditions for therapeutic change. And there are some people who say that the necessary and sufficient conditions are not necessary and sufficient. And let me give you an example of that. The world of trauma has moved on rapidly since the 80s, where post-traumatic stress was first seen as a mental health difficulty, a mental and emotional health difficulty. We know so much more about the the brain and brain processing and how trauma lives in the brain. And I was at a conference last year where one of the delegates said, I'm a directive therapist. I direct people. And I said, what do you do? She says, I'm an eye movement, EMDR therapist. And she teaches people how to move the trauma from one part of the brain to another so it's more easily processed. So she's directive. And for those clients who want, who might want to really treat very, very intense trauma, I think a lot of them would say that maybe person-centered therapy was very helpful to talk about the issues they're having, but to actually treat the trauma, they needed something else. And I think we're seeing this a lot now. I think we're seeing areas of psychotherapy where specific interventions are useful. So that's one criticism. Are the necessary and sufficient conditions necessary and sufficient? And I think the other big criticism is, can therapists consistently show the core conditions, and those core conditions are empathy, congruence, and unconditional positive regard. And there's a writer called Jeffrey Massoud Masson who wrote a book called Against Therapy. And he said, realistically, is it possible for a therapist to continually offer those conditions? And it's brought up a lot of interesting comments. A lot of interesting comment where people have said, well, maybe I've had to kind of act it out a bit in the therapy room, or I might not have offered congruence and unconditional positive regard. So these are very valid. I think these are very valid criticisms, Ken. Very valid.
Yeah, very much so. And I think a great place to look when we're talking about a critique of a model, and we're just specifically looking at a critique of the person-centered model today, but what I'm about to share applies to all models. Within academia, we are encouraged to critically evaluate, and you're going to see that word in your assignments. At high levels, you're going to be asked to critically evaluate. And critical evaluation means looking at what something is useful for and trying to understand maybe where it is less useful. And it's to overcome a bias. It's to overcome the bias that we go, right, this is it. I've got the solution. It's the golden answer to everything, and I'm going to apply it wherever I can. So that's why we're encouraged to look at critiques during our study journey. Not every client, and we're just speaking about person-centered therapy today, but not every client is going to be the best fit for person-centered therapy. So we need to be able to critique the therapy to understand what it will be useful for and when it will not be useful, so that as a counselor, as a psychotherapist, you know when to refer on when something maybe falls outside of the area where you're working within. I think you've said it beautifully, Rory, when you've leveled a couple of critiques on person-centered therapy. I'm going to throw another one in, and I think it was very much a modality of its time, and I'm talking culturally. So if you look at Carl Ransom Rogers, he was a white male. He was living in Western society. It was almost a bit of a golden age. People were buying into the American dream when his theory was being put together. And I wonder if that would apply as well in the Eastern countries, or if you went to Africa and started trying to work with person-centered therapy. And maybe there are parts of it that I guess being empathic is good practice. Maybe there are parts of it that might apply, but parts of it that don't. And that's where the critique comes in really handy. And even empathy, Rory, even empathy at times is not useful to a client, as you have mentioned a number of times. I wonder if you could maybe go into that, because that is an interesting thing. I remember when I first heard that empathy might not be useful to all clients, I thought, how is that possible?
Yeah, it's very possible that a client may want more pragmatic solutions to their issues, and trying to get into their frame of reference about it may feel a bit intrusive, and it may feel like it's a bit of a waste of time for them. Some clients may very well want somebody to say to them, look, how do we get rid of this? Like you go to a doctor. And you'd expect to be given some kind of solution. And in fact, it may be surprising, but there are some therapies that are a bit more solution focused. In fact, there's one called solution focused therapy, the clue's in the name. So you're absolutely right, Ken. Sometimes empathy isn't very, very useful, and I guess with all therapies, it's best fit for clients. That's the thing, and that comes in the assessment piece. So when clients come to us, if we're really clear about what we can offer, it might be, yes, that's what I want. I just want to be heard and want someone to understand from my perspective. But from others, it may be something completely different. They may want more of a solution-based or a more coaching input.
Yes. And I guess when we look to the person-centered modality, it suggested is non-directive, that the client knows the way and will lead the way. So maybe a critique sits right there. Like you've mentioned, Rory, there are clients that will want a more solution-focused approach to their therapy. They come in and they're saying, what do I do here? And an example of that might be someone who comes in and says, look, we're traveling to Europe in 2 weeks' time. I have this fear of getting on aeroplanes, and I want to sort myself out. I want to be able to get on that plane and go to Europe with my family. And if we were to sit there and say, wow, it sounds like that you have a fear of planes, and I wonder what that feels like for you, it is not solution focused. It's not what that client asked for, and it's unlikely that they are going to find a resolution in that from the person-centered modality. And we might use maybe a CBT modality to challenge to challenge the irrational belief that they were going to be harmed in the plane journey. So there are a number of critiques. You are asked to do this in assignments, of course. Don't be scared of it. Have a look at it, compare it to other models, and look at where the critiques may lie. And of course, you said it, Rory. You're talking about the necessary and sufficient, saying you have to have them, and they're enough. They're necessary. Got to have them, and they are sufficient. You don't need anything else. Well, are they? And maybe in some cases they are, but the critique is maybe sometimes they're not. And I know you've spoken about it before, Rory, as being a very shallow, like a canoe. I wonder if you can tell us more about it.
Yes. Well, I wish it was my quote, Ken, to be honest, because I thought it was brilliant when I read it. But someone, and I forget who made the criticism, said that Roger's theories it was like a boat with a very narrow draft. And a narrow draft means that a boat with a narrow draft could get into very, very shallow water and could get anywhere. And I think that is a valid criticism, that Roger's theory would seem on the face of it to be a fix for everything, that you could go anywhere with it. And the fact of the matter is, through this practice, I'm a person-centered therapist. I train in person-centered therapy, and I think it has a huge amount of merit. But there are clients, and Ken's mentioned one or two of them, that may not benefit from non-direct. They may want a more directive approach. The final criticism, which I only found recently, which I thought was absolutely fascinating, was written by someone who was a religious person, a father in the Catholic Church, and who said that the idea that Rogers believed that you could take control of your own life actually went against some religious doctrine where in his view, God takes control of your life. God plans your life out. So there's a little bit of a bump there with people who believe that God guides their destiny, and I'm not making any comments on people's faith position. If that's what you believe, that's what you believe. And the idea that, of course, you can take full control of your life externally from anybody else. I think that's a very interesting perspective, and one that I only recently came across. And finally, there's a book written by David Cohen, a psychologist, called Person-Centered, or Carl Rogers, a critical biography. And he does talk about Rogers' work at Wisconsin, where he did something called a psych project, which was we worked with people who had psychosis, hence the name psych. And they were very poorly, and it was long before we had an understanding of that and the medication and an understanding of psychosis. And the research would indicate that person-centered therapy didn't work very well. In fact, Roger didn't last too long at Wisconsin. It was his last university tenure before he moved on to live in California. So there is a lot of there's lots of really good critique, and as Ken said, by being critical or being a critical friend towards the therapy that we practice, it allows us to make sure that the clients get the best service. In other words, if someone came to me as a practicing therapist and said, I'm afraid of aeroplanes, I'm going on holiday in 3 weeks, can you help me? My answer would have been, well, thank you for getting in contact, but I think you need to speak to someone who's a CBT therapist, and a referral would be made. Same with trauma. You can work so much with trauma, and sometimes person-centered therapy is very, very helpful for people processing the trauma. But I've got a good friend who's a EDMR. I can never pronounce the words in the right order.
EDMR. Yes, you got
EDMR,
it.
thank you. Therapist. And she tells me that the difference is absolutely remarkable for people who've got really stuck with trauma and really need to move on from it. So, as you said, rightly said, Ken, it was a therapy of its time. It's still relevant. The research backs that up, but it's important that we know its limitations.
Definitely. And we find the limitations by understanding the critique. At its pointiest end, you've already mentioned trauma, Rory. We can do damage by using a modality that is not a right fit for a right presentation. PTS, person-centered theory, is not a good modality for that. The last thing you want to be doing is taking the person back and asking them what they're feeling and looking at those. It needs more of a solution focus. That is episode 326 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. The National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, or NCPS, proudly sponsor this podcast, supporting students every step of the way. Join the NCPS for resources, training, and a friendly, knowledgeable community to enhance your learning experience. Visit ncps.com.
Yes, a bit of a marathon today. We started off with ethical, sustainable practice. We talked about ambiguous loss, and of course, that fantastic handout that's available by going to counsellingtutor.com. Look at the podcast tab, episode 326, and that handout for ambiguous loss is waiting for you there, along with some thinking of how to work with ambiguous loss. In Practice Matters, we went really into the future with Nina Solomons, talking about virtual reality in counselling and psychotherapy, and a tool called I Know Me. Really interesting, and may speak to the future of how we practice. The student services, Ken and myself had a little meander around a critique of person-centered therapy. Very helpful for those of you who have got to put a critique in your assignments. Before I go, I'd like to thank everybody who posts a like or shares the podcast on their social media platforms or within their wider community or their professional network. I know that we get people say, I've only just found you, and we really enjoy the podcast. So thank you for the shares and the likes. We really appreciate that, Ken and myself, as we do those people who've taken the time to pop a comment or some feedback on iTunes and to leave us a comment there. We always like that. And it's a great joy to read. We look at them and go, oh, someone else has enjoyed what we do. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.